Another day, another war. The thing is, though, when the world looks like this, what happens on one front inevitably has spillover effects on another, and the consequences may not be obvious. So, today, we will discuss how the outbreak of an air war between Iran and Israel will change the war over in Europe. Specifically, we'll discuss a bunch of tricky things with the oil markets, the future of U.S. politics, the subtle incentives the United States has in allocating aid to each of its partners, how the air war complicates the drone trade between Russia and Iran, the signal it sends about the quality of Russian arms, what this does for Trump's diplomatic efforts with Moscow and Kyiv, and what it reveals about the cohesiveness of the Russian counter-coalition. But let's begin with oil prices. The basic story you might imagine I'm about to tell is that oil markets really do not like instability in the Middle East, and so oil prices will go up. Meanwhile, the Kremlin funds its war in Ukraine through oil receipts, so higher prices, more material for Russia, bad times for Ukraine. Right? Well, the easiest measure of the problem would seem to agree. West Texas Intermediate prices shot up about $8 to $76 per barrel in the immediate aftermath of Israel's first strikes. However, the problem with looking at the markets is that both Iranian and Russian oil operate on a completely separate track. Welcome to the world of Western sanctions, where Moscow and Tehran have to seek salvation from Beijing. Trying to get reliable pricing in such a shadow market is difficult, but some Econ 101 will help us out. Generally speaking, China pays less for Iranian and Russian barrels because few other countries are willing to break the Western sanctions regime. Lower demand, lower prices. So, on the macro scale, the two prices tend to track each other, but the price that Beijing pays is lower. Thus, if the world price generally jumps, so too will the alternative price. However, the air war is affecting oil futures in two separate ways. First is the possibility that oil will come off the global market generally, perhaps because the situation escalates, and Iran takes a risk by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, which would handicap oil exports from a bunch of key players: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq. But I have already spoken for 90 minutes on the subject. Regardless, that would bring about the aforementioned good news for Moscow, reflected in the higher West Texas Intermediate oil prices. Beyond that, there is the possibility that the Iranian oil specifically will come off of the market. Because Israel is targeting Iran's oil infrastructure. This would still result in an increase in the global market's prices, but the spike would be even larger in the shadow market. Essentially, the spread between the two starts to converge. The basic idea is that the shadow market has a smaller overall supply, and so it is more sensitive to losing a single country's barrels. That would mean that the $8 shift in West Texas Intermediate actually underrepresents the gains that Russia makes from the affair. Keep in mind, of course, that these prices will remain in flux as the situation evolves. West Texas Intermediate was back down to $72 a barrel at the time of writing, only a $4 increase from the pre-strike price. If that goes higher, though, U.S. consumers will start to feel the effects of inflation, and that could be a problem. Actually, that provides a good segue to our next topic, which is the effect on U.S. domestic politics. To put it mildly, the general consensus is that Trump's victory in the November 2024 election has been a net negative for Ukraine regarding the war. Trump, of course, is term limited in the 2028 election, but well before that is the 2026 midterm elections, which is an opportunity for Democrats to try to retake control of Congress and shift the agenda in their favor. There is also a chance that a blue wave causes congressional Republicans to reevaluate what the post-Trump world looks like, and thus they may begin to push back against his policies. Well, remember that Trump largely won the 2024 election because of voters' beliefs that he would better manage the U.S. economy than the incumbent Democratic ticket. Any inflationary pressures come November 2026 would be bad for the now incumbent Republican Party, as taming inflation was the centerpiece of Trump's economic message. And that could have spillover effects on how the war in Ukraine unfolds. That, of course, assumes that Russia is still pressuring the front lines in eastern Ukraine. But that does seem more likely after all of Trump's diplomatic efforts from the last few months have gone absolutely nowhere. It also assumes that Israel and Iran will not more directly affect U.S. politics, say by inducing American troops to intervene in the conflict. However, discussing that part seems like something best classified as a bridge to cross when we come to it. Then again, there is something related that is happening right now. And for another convenient segue, let's pivot to Washington's decision on how to allocate assistance to Ukraine and Israel. Now, you might hear two different takes on what is happening here, yet neither of those is the full story. One perspective is that a greater need to assist Israel has no bearing on Ukraine, because the Trump administration has already abandoned Ukraine, and all that is really getting drained is the effort to coerce China. That is outright false. In fact, a couple of small aid packages to Ukraine have recently come through. Emphasis on small, but they are still coming. Obviously, the situation is worse than it was under the Biden administration. It is just not as dire as much of the online discourse makes it out to be. Meanwhile, the opposite perspective is that Ukraine is now in trouble because the United States is going to reroute to Israel some of the aid that might have otherwise gone to Ukraine. That is closer to the truth, but it overstates what the consequences to Ukraine will be, at least in the short run. All reports indicate that the United States was well aware of Israel's plan to attack Iran, because, well, Israel privately communicated as much. Thus, from a policymaker's perspective, Washington has been ahead of us for at least a month now, if not more. In turn, whatever initial effects there are of the United States' prioritization problem have already been borne out. The public is just becoming aware of it now. It is possible, of course, that the war will escalate, and that will change how the Trump administration handles its allocation decisions. But that is not a concern for Ukraine right now. Sticking with military procurement for a second, let's switch the perspective and look at Iranian assistance to Russia. Those following the invasion will recall how, more than a year ago, Iran began supplying Russia with Shahed-style drones. Iran has had the advantage of living under Western sanctions for decades, and thus Tehran knew how to supply parts for the Shaheds without relying on Europe or elsewhere. In turn, Iran made a quick ruble by shipping them to Russia, which was still working out how to get by without European suppliers. In the time since, the Kremlin has used the Shaheds to repeatedly target Ukrainian cities. Obviously, Iran now needs its own fleet of drones to volley back at Israel, and thus Iran will be prioritizing Iranian production for the Iranian war effort. It would therefore be tempting to conclude that Ukraine may soon be getting some relief. Well, this is one of those things that the fog of war obfuscates. Presumably, Iran was still shipping Russia some number of Shaheds recently. However, Iran licensed production of the Shahed to Russia. Fast forward a long period of time, and Russia is now domestically manufacturing a majority, or even the vast majority of them, under the name Garan 2, and all of those go toward the Russian war effort. In turn, and unfortunately for Ukraine, any relief on the Shahed front will likely be minimal. A quick related point about the agreement between Russia and Iran, and what it says about the Russian arms trade more generally. Iran was not just giving away its Shahed technology for free. Indeed, one of the things that Russia shipped over in return was advanced air defense. Well, Israel has made a mockery of it, quickly taking control of the skies over Iran. Part of that appears due to Iran's own inability to keep its own borders secure from localized drone assaults. Where have I heard that one before? But part of it is because the Russian air defenses were simply not up to the task. We have discussed before how the Russian arms trade was already in trouble due to the country's poor performance in Ukraine. Well, now we are seeing it struggle on yet another dimension, which will further cut off a source of revenue for Russia once the war in Ukraine ends, and Moscow has the spare capacity to reinitiate the arms trade. There are a couple of other good pieces of news for Ukraine, though. Let's start with the Trump administration's bottleneck problem. If you believe that Trump's attempts to reach a diplomatic outcome to the war have done more harm than good, well, he is about to have his time split between two conflicts. That may mean that he abandons the peace process between Ukraine and Russia. Whatever happens next with the aforementioned U.S. aid allocations, it will give Europe some clearer directions on what the continent should best do for itself. And maybe that will result in less indecision about passing aid provisions or tougher enforcement of the sanctions regime. That, in turn, will put Ukraine on better footing. In a final and a bit of a fluffier point, this whole process is about to reveal the lack of cohesion inside of Russia's ad hoc counter-coalition. What I'm referring to is that loose confederation of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Yemeni Houthis, who are all united in their opposition to the current Western order. If you have been watching this channel enough, then you already know why I added the scare quotes around united. That being drawn together in opposition to something is not the same as sharing a common goal. Each of them wants to implement a policy that has nothing to do with any others. So whether Russia succeeds in conquering Ukraine means little to anyone sitting in Beijing, except for how it may enfeeble the West in trying to stop the PRC from taking control of Taiwan. That is why China helps Russia by doing things that bring in money, like importing cheap oil. But you do not see Beijing taking actions that would draw the ire and thus the economic wrath of the West. Well, the transactional nature of the counter-coalition is about to become more apparent to casual observers. For all of those Shahed drones that made their way to Russian warehouses not too long ago, you might have noticed that Moscow has not exactly come to the rescue of Tehran since the air war began. And that will make it just a bit more difficult for the narrative that the West will be unable to withstand the pressures from the counter-coalition. So, there you have it. 7 ways that the Israel-Iran war changes the Russia-Ukraine war. Have any questions about what is happening in the world now that we have another war on our hands? Well, I'm covering both wars. Ask your question in the comment section, and I will answer some of them soon in a Q&A video over on Lines on Maps Extra. Meanwhile, if you are seeking extra information about the first of the wars, then here are 2 awesome books about the subject. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.